universities and, has a very impressive resume. And what I noticed about him was that he never led with that. And he never bragged about it or talked about it. He didn't do the name dropping. And so I always thought he was a very humble person and just kind of like steady, chill. He was not loud. And so I was reading these things about narcissism and narcissists, and it was like there's some parts of it as far as like the cycle of the abuse, but a lot of this doesn't resonate. And I was just like, what am I dealing with? Like, what am I dealing with? It was, my eyes started to get open. And then around the same time when he was doing this kind of not really getting work done, spending a lot of time outside of the house, not really caring about the impact on me and how it was affecting my productivity and my mental health. He started doing this thing where he started to actually be mean to me. Like it was starting to be like he was showing meanness. And I had really rarely experienced anything like that, but with him in particular, he had always been someone that I was like, oh, he's the nicest guy and he's so kind. And, I could never imagine him being angry. And all of a sudden there was this coldness about him. And I noticed that he stopped looking at me when he would talk to me. If we were in the house and I was trying to make casual conversation or, talk to him about something, and not necessarily about our relationship, but just like regular, day-to-day conversation, he wouldn't make eye contact with me. He was acting like he was too busy, which is another sign of the intimacy anorexia. I actually read all of the different, I don't know what you call them, but the traits of it, and he had about 9 of the 10. And so I was like, oh my God, I'm dealing with somebody that like is intentionally withholding affection, time, compliments, intimacy, everything that you can imagine that you can possibly, that would make life interesting and worth living. He's pulling away from me, and it's just me. So that sucked. But he started this new thing where if I came upstairs to where our work area was in the home, he wouldn't take his eyes off the computer. He would be very curt. He would blink his eyes like he was annoyed. His body language was he wasn't facing me, so his face, like when I would talk to him and I would give him eye contact and not leaning in, but just facing, treating him the way that you, like when you talk to people and you face them and you give direct eye contact, or you at least are standing in their, in a direction facing them. I would notice he would stop doing that. And then when we would work together at our remote office, he would, all of a sudden he'd be leaving and running out all the time, and there would be no conversation with me. There would be nothing to talk about. He had nothing really to say unless it related to work. And then if it did relate to work, I found it very difficult for him to understand me, I had to do a lot of explaining. And it almost felt like he was starting to question my intelligence and my aptitude. And so I would be on edge sometimes and be defensive. And at the time we actually had an intern. And before this affair happened, or before it was exposed, the intern was, she was on board, but I was always left with her. I was always left with having to give her assignments and spend time with her and answer questions. And he was always just, all right, I'm leaving, guys. Let's have our meeting. All right, I got to go. I have blah, 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 blah. And he'd just leave. And then I'd be with her. And that was basically the status quo and the way everything worked with the interns that we had. It was like he would hire them and I would be responsible for management and supervision. And then he would just disappear. And so we worked a lot from home and sometimes remotely at the office, but it was almost like I always had an anchor. And so that meant that I couldn't go anywhere. And that allowed him the freedom to do what he was doing. And I wasn't aware of that because I was a bit of a homebody, but there was just such an imbalance of responsibility. And he always gave this impression that he was so busy and he had so much stuff going on and he didn't have time to talk to the intern. He didn't have time to talk to me about some issues and he needed me to figure these things out on my own. So it always felt like it started to feel like I was being, and this was before the betrayal, it was like he was finding a way for me not to reach out and to take any of his time. He wanted me to do the work so that was plug and play. And he wanted to have the freedom and the ability to move freely without any responsibility at home or to me. And if I, did happen to have a question or a follow-up or needed something from him, it was like, those situations where you're dealing with like super, and I used to work around high net worth people, the people that are super busy. And so you like carve out like 15 minutes to give them like an update and tell them what to sign or whatever. And, that's all you get. And you have to shoot and that's how it often felt with him, where I always felt like I started to feel like I was a bother and that, and I would, of course, when I had an issue, I would try to resolve it before I brought it to him. But once it got to a point where I needed his input and I brought it to him, he would sometimes, there'd be some annoyance and I need you to be able to figure this out. And I'm like, well, if you actually haven't trained me in this business, we started this, but this was not my core experience and I'm learning, but you haven't actually taken the time to train me and to mentor me. And then he would always, talk about how no one else he ever hired ever needed that, and they were self-starters. And it was just always this slighting of, and I've always been assertive and proactive and a self-starter. I have never in my entire career ever had feedback that indicated otherwise. And I always had great reviews and feedback about my aptitude and my attitude. And so it was disappointing to get that type of feedback from my life partner and someone who I loved and who I respected and who I, wanted to support, but who just seemed like everything was a problem, whether it was like, well, I need you to stop texting me. I need you to use this program. And then I'd use that program. He's like, well, I don't look at it. I'm too busy. And so everything was, it felt like I was damned if I did and damned if I didn't. And if I tried to figure out a way to get on the same page, it was, I don't have time for this, or it's just and that was kind of I realized now that was the abuse, that was the devaluing behavior, that was the subtle, knocks to my self-esteem and the thing I held dearly and took a great pride in was my work acumen and my ability to learn and execute. And it just felt like it was subtly being questioned, or if I didn't know something, it was on me to figure it out. And I'm like, listen, I'm not an intern. I'm, number one, I'm your life partner. And number two, I have experience and I know how to work in professional environments, but I also know that it's impossible to learn something in a vacuum. You have to sometimes be taught, or you may have to take some time out to, carve some time out for me so I can learn and become a subject matter expert if that's what you're expecting. And so those were the, pretty consistent conversations we would have. And then when this happened, he became even less accessible. And so I would spend, because I was going through this and because he had stopped coming home regularly, I would literally just stay in the home had always been my place of my sanctuary. I worked out of there, and it was a beautiful home, and it had a lot of light and an outdoor space, and it was comfortable and beautiful, and it just felt great to be there. And so I'd be there all day working, and he would be out the house pretty much all day, and, come home throughout the day if he had meetings to change his outfits, because he did have sometimes different meetings that required different dress codes. Or he'd go to the gym and then he'd need to change. And so that was part of the rotation. And, but that home had always felt very comfortable for me. And then suddenly when this happened, I would just get up and shower and leave all day and not come home until as late as possible. And I would spend the day alone, because he would either stay out with, the woman he was seeing at her home, and I would see him in the office, and then he was constantly in and out, and all of a sudden his phone was very important to him. He was texting, and his phone was no longer on silent anymore. It used to always, I never heard it, and all of a sudden it was always going off, and it started to trigger me, because every time there was a text, I just imagined he was texting her or texting somebody else. And, my phone wasn't going off. My phone, he was the only person that I spoke to on a daily basis. He was the person that called me every day. And all of a sudden, that wasn't happening. And so I wanted to deal with that. I tried to take some control over my life, so I just would put my phone on D&D, because at least I couldn't hear when it didn't ring, as opposed to when it did ring, because it just wasn't ringing anymore. And I wasn't getting text messages or calls throughout the day, and it was just so painful that I blocked everyone off. I didn't want my phone to go off and then be disappointed constantly when it wasn't him. So I did that, and there was just such a stark contrast. His mood just changed so quickly, and, I was still very much involved in the business, and he still wasn't really doing things, but that was my coping mechanism, throwing myself into work and keeping myself distracted. I was becoming more and more productive, because I was sitting there for hours, and if I did leave, I would go to the gym for, sometimes up to 2 hours, and just sit there and just sweat and think and shower. And I didn't touch a machine, because I was just still losing weight and barely eating. But I was doing what I thought was helpful for my mental health and self-care. I needed to do something good for myself, because I was not getting nourished emotionally, psychologically, nutritionally. I just wasn't, I needed something that was good. And I was in such a fog that I spent so much time alone and in silence. That was the other thing. I went from starting my day listening to NPR, and, we'd have the Sonos just play our station, and we'd listen to the news and start our day. And then I'd take my phone into the shower and listen to a podcast about entrepreneurship. And I was always thinking outside of the box and looking towards the future, and had this positive mindset, and woke up every day very grateful. And all of a sudden, once this happened to me, I couldn't listen to anything. I didn't want to listen to podcasts. I couldn't listen to music. I couldn't listen to the news. And so I would wake up and alone, and I would just get in the shower as quickly as possible, get dressed, and get out of the house, pack my bag for the day, and try to be out as much as possible. And sometimes I would just try to stay out really, really long, just so if he did come home, it would look like I had something to do and that I had a life. But it wasn't. How could I? I was devastated. I was devastated, and I was embarrassed and humiliated. And sometimes I would do that, and he wouldn't even be home. So, and, he wouldn't even see where I was because he wasn't home.